Alright, coolio. So let's start with the very beginning. 1492, Spain made Cuba a colony because that was their wonderful colonial time. Some very important stuff to note because this will affect the rest of history from this point onward is basically Cuba is divided into the west and the east. The U.S. is divided kind of in the north and the south. It's a similar kind of deal, except you flip it 90 degrees. So the east, that's going to be everything kind of on the right of the Sierra Maestra, and that mountain range is very important. We can see here that the east is got all of the plantations, which means that is mostly in the impoverished. You're going to looking at black people, it's underdeveloped. And this is partly because, one, it has more fertile soil, and two, the west coast is going to have a lot of ports, which are very important for trading and such, but it also means that when the Spanish are coming and they're building their homes, they're going to be building them near the ports. They're going to be trading with Florida. They're going to be trading with Mexico. So that area is going to get a lot of development. And Cuba is going to develop a west versus east instead of a north versus south. They're racist. Very fun. And that's going to go on until about the 1800s. In 1853, the book kind of skips the first and second revolution, but the third revolution is mildly relevant. I say mildly because this guy, his name is Jose Marti, I don't know. My pronunciation is going to be extremely American throughout this whole thing, and you can cope with that because this is being recorded at 3 a.m. Alright, anyway, so this man, Jose Marti, he is the leader of the Third Revolution of Cuba's independence from Spain, and he's kind of important. Anyway, so at this point, the U.S. has been investing pretty heavily in Cuban industries, especially in plantations such as the sugarcane plantations. And so now they have a personal stake in Cuba. So when Jose Marti is going around and he's starting this revolution, they're thinking that, hey, this is a chance to steal Cuba from Spain and kind of make it their own colony. And that'd be very, financially beneficial. So now they're kind of helping Marti and other Cuban nationalists to gain their independence. So that's why in 1886, Spain bans slavery. This is kind of like, we're not in an apartheid or civil rights unit, so that's pretty irrelevant. But they banned slavery to try and placate Marti and the other nationalists. It doesn't work. In 1898, this part's relevant. The USS Maine blows up in Havana Harbor. The U.S. blame it on the Spanish, but it's not actually the Spanish's fault. The same year, the U.S. declares war. The Spanish-American War is fought rather swiftly, and the U.S. walks away with Cuba as a territory. In 1901, the Platt Amendment is passed, and this is basically just saying that, hey, the U.S. is going to give protection to Cuba, and in exchange, Cuba is going to have to give up its right to kind of sovereignty. Basically, the U.S. can at any time, for any reason, intervene militarily in Cuban affairs. And this manifests pretty quickly. In 1902, obviously the U.S. wants to promote its own interests, so they rig the elections of this new Cuban government, and they put essentially a dictator in charge, but they're willing to allow this dictator to reign because he's pro-U.S. policy. And so he's very corrupt, he's very violent and cruel with how he's carrying out his government. So there's an increase in wealth disparity, an increase in anti-U.S. sentiment. There's a very small wealthy minority, and that wealthy minority is mostly Americans with plantations and other industrialists. Obviously, there's a lot of protests, especially among the student population, the educated, people who have time on their hands but not a lot of power to do anything. This is the dictator. His name is Gerardo Machado. He basically never reappears past this period. He was also the reigning dictator during the stock market crash of 1929, and due to his already corrupt and very brutal regime, the depression only worsened people's view of him. And so, with all of this anger, of course, at some point it was going to boil over, and there was the Sergeants' Revolt. Basically, NCOs, non-commissioned officers, they went ahead and arrested their higher-ups for corruption. And it's very important that at this point, there's a sergeant named Fulgencio Batista. Batista is going to basically lead this sergeant's revolt in Machado's overthrow. My understanding, because I'm not a military person, is that NCOs are like lower in rank than commissioned officers. So it's kind of like it's like a 1984 thing, the proles rising up, I don't know. Anyway, what is important to note about this is that Machado is basically over, but that doesn't mean that the U.S. has lost its influence. However, it does mean that Bautista has gotten a very large increase in rank. He's now going to have control over the army for a very, very long time because he was the one who, organized this army turnover. So he's going to become the chief of the armed forces. Machado's going to resign or get fired, whatever you want to think about it. But either way, he's gone. And now they need a new government. So this new government that's going to arise, it's going to only exist for a year. It's called the Revolutionary Directorate. It's led by an educated man this time. He's like a professor, Dr. Ramon Grau. And there's the rest of his name, San Martin. But he's pretty liberal in a lot of his promises. And that's all fine and dandy, He's promising democracy, equality, wages, lower prices because the economy is still shit, female suffrage. But the really big kicker, the reason that the U.S. doesn't support him is because he supports the annulment of the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment, again, that allows the U.S. to intervene in Cuban affairs, and this is a very nationalistic idea. I think at this point it's a good point to introduce the party that he's part of. He's part of the Auténticos. The Auténticos are, they later become conservative, but as you can see, they're a little liberal right now with all these promises because it's a new government. But the Auténticos, at their core, are nationalists. They want to be separate from the U.S. That's obviously going to change kind of over time as corruption sets in, but like most political parties, they're pretty nice when they first start out, at least in the eyes of the people. And so, the Auténticos have their supporters. Somewhat important person to note is Eduardo Rivas. He's under the Auténticos, he's liberal. But of course, Bautista, he's pretty aware of what the U.S. is thinking. They want to protect their interests. So, because Bautista controls the army, when he changed his support from Grau's government to a more right-wing leader, Colonel Carlos Mendieta, the U.S. will, of course, back Bautista. So without Bautista's army supporting Grau's government falls. And that basically means that the new ruler is Colonel Carlos Mendieta. Carlos doesn't stay very long. In the end, it's really Bautista who's pulling the strings because he's running the army. So because Mendieta is very conservative, social and economic reforms are going to halt. And because there's, no more reforms being made, and that was the whole point of the revolution, there's going to be protests again, there's going to be strikes, regular stuff. And because of all these strikes and protests, Mendieta is going to do what all the other Cuban leaders did, and he's going to increase police brutality, he's going to enact martial law, and the following presidents are going to do essentially the same thing. Of course, because protests and constant economic crises are not great for business, the U.S. is going to want to intervene. So they acknowledge that the cartels and the gangs of Cuba, which are going to run rampant throughout this period in history, they have power. They have manpower, they have influence. So they're going to offer these gang leaders government positions to try and appease them, get the nation somewhat under control. They don't care who's running it as long as it's running and good for business. This doesn't work because a gang member is a gang member, and it wasn't a popular decision among the people. And so at the end, the U.S. is really struggling to contain the situation. The government's struggling to contain the situation, but Batista's got his influence. And even though the system is pretty rigged, they do have 4-year terms, just like the U.S. government. And in 1940, Bautista is elected president. So the important things to note about Bautista is that he's not white. The other previous rulers were. And he comes from somewhat humble origins, like, his parents were farmers. He's he's served in the army. He's got military experience. He's just like everyone else, right? That's what he's going to sell the people. So his main supporters are going to be the other non-white people and everyone else who he bribed. So this is the wonderful category. You've got the journalists, clergymen, and union leaders. They support him because he bribed them. Non-white soldiers, again, he was a soldier, so he was promising them a higher pay and promotions that they would otherwise not get, because racism is still very prominent in this region and will be for several more decades. Probably to this day, actually. Anyway, so the working class also support him, mostly because he's not white. It's kind of like a Barack Obama situation, and because of his humble origins, blah, 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 you get the idea. So he is not communist in any way. He's more conservative. He's part of the Auténticos. And he's pushing for, because, again, he's always been he's going to side with the U.S. for his whole life, essentially. And so he's appealing to these industrialists and the rich. He's giving them loopholes, like government loopholes. But to placate the communists and the socialists, he's enacting some labor laws, some social reforms, but not as many as Grau was promising. And because he wants to consolidate his power, he's going to denounce Grau's government as fascist. That's going to be a theme throughout every single president we go through. Whatever the previous president was, they're going to be labeled as a traitor or something. And another important thing to note is the time, 1941. World War II is ongoing, and because the U.S. is using up a lot of their rations, they're going to need sugar. And what do you know? Cuba makes a lot of sugar. So there's going to be an increased standard of living as the citizens notice, the economy is going great. And Bautista is going to experience his most popular term in power, 1940 to 1944. It will never be more popular than this. This is his peak, which is very important because he's going to get more corrupt. Anyway, 1944, his term ends. So Bautista has to give up his presidency to somebody, and that somebody is Grau. Grau takes over for whatever reason, and Bautista is very ambitious politically. He does not want to give up power, and we can see evidence of his future plotting for a coup because he actually took money from the treasury with him, and then he went to Mexico or Florida or somewhere to try and cripple Grau's government before it even got off the ground. That didn't work. Anyway, at this point, it should be noted that Grau is no longer kind of adhering to those earlier policies, his promises from earlier, like equality, democracy, higher wages, lower prices. All of that is kind of getting tossed out the window. He's acting very corrupt, and some people are seeing this. They're seeing what's happening in Auténticos and Grau's party and the PSP, and the PSP. The PSP that's the Popular Socialist Party. That's just they're basically communists. So you've got the communists and the Auténticos, the PSPs and the Auténticos. And these politicians are corrupt. So Eduardo Chiba, he founds the party, I'm just going to call it in English. I can't do the Spanish shit. The Orthodox Party. The Orthodox Party is mostly central. It's liberal leaning, but it's more moderate. And it's supposed to be like an alternative to these two very, very radical factions. You don't want to be on the extremes. It's the moderate option. And this is where Fidel Castro will join. Castro is in law school right now, so he's not doing a whole lot, but he's there. He's getting into politics, getting some power. Anyway, so Grau and the Auténticos, they're using a lot of intimidation, bribery, violence. This is end of World War II, 1948 kind of timeline. And he got to his position partially because the gang leaders were supporting him. And that meant that he was going to be giving them government positions because that's, how nepotism kind of works. You help your friends or whatever. It's the spoil system. I'm so smart. Anyway, so again, Grau's going to want to consolidate his power just like Bautista was before him. And that means that he's going to want to assassinate the Orthodox members of this new alternative political party. And the gang members, of course, they're going to recognize that if you're trying to assassinate somebody, they're going to try and assassinate you back. So the Orthodox Party and the PSPs, they are sending in, and Bautista's supporters, they are trying to assassinate Grau. So the gang members give Grau bodyguards that are not that dissimilar from the SA soldiers from Nazi Germany in the earlier years that would protect Hitler. So 1948 rolls around, it's time for a new president. This one is basically copy-paste of Grau. He is also corrupt. He favors the rich, and like the other Auténticos, he's just not that great. That's 1948. He's going to rule from 1948 to 1952. The book will henceforth refer to him as President Prio. So Castro is seeing what's going on. These are called the Auténtico presidents. They reign from Grau to Prio, so 1944 to 1952. And these people are super corrupt. And Castro sees this. He says, this is not great. I think this is bad. And that's not a great thing to hear, when you're the leader. So they try and kill him. And Castro and his brother flee the country. Did I forget his brother? His brother's in here too. His name's Raul. Comes up sometimes, but Castro's more popular, so I'm going to refer to Castro. So they leave the country for a little bit. He's going to come back eventually. And in 1951, because 1952 is the election year, the politics are really heating up. The PSPs are basically out of the game, and when I say the Auténticos, yes, Bautista is technically part of the Auténticos, but I mean like Grau and Prio. Those are the main candidates, and Bautista is in third. And so Eduardo Chiba, he's the one who founded the Orthodox Party. He's noticing that Bautista is getting antsy, and he said, an important thing about Chiba is a radio host and a politician, so this was like his big hurrah. He killed himself on air and was like, yeah, Bautista is definitely going to have a coup if he doesn't win this election. Then he killed himself. But there was a commercial break, so no one saw it. Anyway, moving on, so it goes. 1952, the election rolls around, and it looks like President Prio is about to be winning. But before it can finish, the U.S. Mafia, when I say mafia, I don't mean like the Italian mob. I mean like just drug people, probably in Florida, honestly. I think they're still there. They offer Prio, money to step down because, again, Prio is an Auténtico. Auténticos want to be separate from the U.S. So Prio is offered money, but Prio is offered money to step down so Bautista can win. Because if Prio and the other, or Grau don't step down, Bautista will never win. He's in third. Prio doesn't take the offer, but it doesn't matter because Bautista has a coup. He never really lets the election results play out. He sees his power for himself. Fuck the election, am I right? Anyway, I love how there's a little note here, but Castro is in the Orthodox Party as a congressional candidate. That's just showing that Castro is alive. So during this Bautista coup, he seizes power very, very quickly, and there wasn't a lot of opposition. So, one, Bautista still is in control of the military, just like he was before. He never really that influence never went away. So that means that he controls the BRAC. They're going to come up again. They're his secret police. They're like the equivalent of the Nazi Germany SS or Gestapo. And then, the public don't really give a shit who's in power. They can't say anything. Can't do anything. So no one's stopping him on that front. Different guy, same flavor. Bautista also, moderately promised free elections in 1954. That would be the next election. But it's important to note the timeline. So it wasn't that long ago since the Sergeants' Revolt in 1933. It's 20 years later. For a government, that's pretty young. So his reasoning was partially that, the reason he was saying that we need to hold off on elections is that, the government's corrupt, we need time to settle. That was his reasoning. He also accused Priaulx of starting a coup, so he was saying that he was just preemptively starting the coup. He was not, that was a lie. And the U.S. didn't care because, Bautista's pro-U.S., so who gives a shit? Of course, Bautista's not stupid. He recognizes that across the Caribbean and Latin America, the U.S. is putting in a lot of dictatorships that are favorable for the U.S. They don't care who's running because the U.S. is concerned with Russia. They also want to get satellite states, and they don't care how they have to do it. And that's a very real risk. Bautista does not want the U.S. intervening in Cuba. Even if they're increasing their influence, they don't want them to full-on intervene. So, to not appear too communist, because again, this is during the Cold War, he stops all reforms, and he's using a lot of government corruption and violence to keep the protests under control, because people aren't happy about that. It was a very bad time. And at this point, again, Castro and the other Orthodox members are getting pretty fed up with this. As an alternative party member, they can't even run properly. And they're being, abused just like the other citizens. So, this is going to be an important date. On the 26th of July in 1953, Castro, his brother Raul, and about 160 other rebels from the Orthodox Party, they get together and try and get a coup going. It's similar to Hitler's beer hall putsch kind of thing. So the idea was that they're going to once again use the divided nature of the land. I don't know if you remember this. I sure hope you do. So, yeah, here's Cuba, right? They are here. They're in the eastern region. These are all the poor people. Yada, yada, yada. So Moncada Barracks, that's a place in Oriente, in the east. So they were planning to capture this barracks, and then once they captured the barracks, they're going to call the public to action, and I guess the plan was that they were going to just have a revolution from there. It wasn't that well thought out. It obviously failed. But this date, M26-7, will become relevant later. It's going to be what Castro's going to memorialize this day as if they didn't fail. So the coup gets failed. Castro and the other rebels are mostly tortured and killed by Bautista. But the thing is, it was a really close call. The officer who was supposed to kill Castro, his brother, and some other guys, instead of torturing and killing him, like the rest of the squad was, he actually spares them. For some reason. I don't know why. I guess he felt merciful that day. Anyway, so it gets out to the public that Bautista has, murdered and tortured these people. So to try and quell public opinion, Bautista actually gives them a trial. And now that Castro has a trial, a public trial, which is very important, he can get his message out during his trial. He can use this as a platform. And use it as a platform he does. He outlines, during his trial, he basically gives his Moncada program. That is the Cuban equivalent of Mein Kampf. It's just out giving his dream for a more equal society, what he wants, his plans for the future, etc., etc. And the way that he delivers his speech is very eloquent, or so I'm told. I never watched it. And that gives him a lot of supporters. He's still jailed, but his sentence is pretty low, actually. It's only 15 months. For a coup, that's pretty good. The fact he's not dead is pretty good. That's in the wrong section, by the way. So he's going to be in jail. And in 1954, I don't know if you remember, but Bautista did promise in 1952 that he would give a free election. So he actually somewhat abides by his own promises. And he laxes the censorship laws, which, by the way, have been in place. It's not a very free society. And he's allowing more political parties to enter this race. And that means that now people can campaign for Castro's release from prison, because Castro rule and his supporters, just the Orthodox Party in general, they do have a decent amount of public support. People are agreeing with their distaste for what Bautista is doing. And so, yeah, that campaign is going on. And Bautista wins. Obviously, he would never rig the election. He only wanted the election to seem free, but it was never truly free. And this is the cycle. Conditions were awful, causing protests. The protests get worse, so the government represses them, causing worse conditions. The cycle repeats, blah, blah, blah. In 1955, Castro and his brother are released from prison, but because they are such outspoken leaders, the BRAC, the secret police, are obviously out for their heads, so they flee to Mexico pretty briefly. Or not briefly, they just flee to Mexico. From this point onward in the notes, Castro will be represented with a bowl because he had a love for ice cream, and he tried to get a dairy industry started in Cuba, but it didn't work out because it's super hot and not ideal for growing cattle. It should also be noted that Cuba is like the size of Florida. So these numbers are not the millions, hundreds of thousands you would expect. Anyway, this all happened. So now that Castro and Raul are in, now that they're in Mexico, they have not given up on their coup plan. So they're planning another thing. They've got some new allies. So Frank Pais, he's going to be kind of their man in the inside, along with others, but he's like a name that comes back at some point. So these, in each city, there's going to be an underground a chapter of the main organization. They're going to be called M26 7 Cells, M26 for movement, for more, that one, Moncada. Moncada 26/7 Moncada, and then 26 being the 26th day, and then the 7th being July. That's just a reference to their failed uprising here. Anyway, so that's happening. And these cells, they're gonna get weapons. They're gonna distribute all the information about what Castro is trying to do. And Frank Pais is in charge of Santiago. Santiago is a city in the east. It's going to be important for their plan. And some new people, they join because of the cells. They find out about Castro's mission and they join his party, including Ernesto Che Guevara. He's a communist doctor. As you can see, some communists are really getting attracted to Castro's ideology, even though at this point in time, Castro is not a proclaimed communist. Like, he's not full commie right now. There's also this guy who was briefly mentioned for some reason. Anyway, so yeah, again, varying levels of Marxism, but they all hate American capitalism. That's like what's their common enemy. So the PSP, so now we're in 1955. This is all going on. We're still in 1955, actually. So here's the current state of politics. The PSP, they supported Bautista way back in 1940. I don't know if you remember, but in 1940 to 1944, that was when Bautista was, actually in power legitimately. He was elected there, and a big part of his supporting base was actually the Communist Party. But right now, at this point in time, the Communist Party no longer is really friends with Bautista. Bautista does not like the communists. And the public in general still is kind of divided on communism. So Bautista accuses Castro of being a communist. And Castro points out that, if anything, Bautista is the communist because the PSP supported him in the past. That's kind of a throwaway, but that's basically just there to show you that communism is very weird. The people's attitudes towards communism is divided. And Castro was not always a communist. That's the takeaway. All right. The takeaway of this part is that Castro was not always a communist. Or not fully dedicated, anyway. So now we're flashback to 1956. This is very important. Now that there's more M26-7 movement members, they were all recruited in cells. There's a bit of there's more people in Cuba. Castro is going to come up with a plan to invade, because way back in 1955 when he got released from prison, he promised his supporters that he would come back in 1956. That's what this was. He promised to return by 1956, and he was intending on keeping that promise because he recognized, the importance of keeping your word when all the politicians before you have broken their promises. So, even though, yes, there's more members and there's more supplies, there's definitely not enough for this revolution, but Castro goes ahead and does it anyway. So, while Castro is in Mexico, he gets 82 freaking mental people, and he trains them to fight. And he buys this old yacht from money that he got from somewhere, and it's called the Grandma. And that's a pretty apt name, because guess what? It's leaky, it's decrepit, and it's going to fall apart by the time they get to shore. So the idea was that Castro and, his ragtag group, they're going to go to Cuba. And as they're sailing to Cuba, which is going to take about 2 days, the M26-7 cells that he has stationed throughout the eastern part of Cuba, they're going to riot. And of course, Bautista's forces are going to come in and quell the riot, but the idea was that Castro's forces, those 82 men, were miraculously going to turn the tide of war, and they would spark a revolution that would help them overthrow Bautista. Now, even if that plan worked, here's what really ended up happening. Grandma, the ship, the yacht that Castro bought, it got caught in a really bad storm. So even though the M26-7 cells did riot, Bautista's forces quickly overwhelmed them, and the M26-7 forces had to disband. So when Castro's boat did eventually come on shore, Bautista's army was waiting for them. So this says Castro on shore. And, they saw Castro coming, so they massacred Castro's men. Of the 82, only about 18 survived. And so Castro, Raul, and these 18 survivors, they fled into the Sierra Mountains. And just in case you forgot where that is, that's like what divides the West and the East, kind of, in this region. So there's not many of them. There's like 20 people. And these supporters of Castro are called the Fidelistas, because Fidel Castro. Anyway, so they need support. They need people, they need supplies. And the way they're going to get their people and supplies is they're going to get the public support of the people in the region. These people are poor, they're very disillusioned with the government, so it's not going to take a whole lot to impress them. So first, they do things that will really just improve their public perception. The Fidelistas, they teach these mostly illiterate people to read and write. Guevara, I hope you remember that guy. He's right here, Guevara. He was one of the people that Castro recruited way back when he was in Mexico. So Guevara's out here. He's a trained doctor, and there's basically no medical care in this area. So he was often one of the only doctors that these people would see for miles, and he just treated everyone. So, of course, that's going to increase public opinion of the Fidelistas. The Fidelistas were also under strict orders to be very nice to the locals because they needed their support, and that included helping the peasants with manual labor. And while they're working in the fields with them, they're going to tell them about the Moncada program, what Castro is doing, and that's just generally going to increase their morale. What really gets people, actively supporting them is the fact that the Castro and his men are going around to different towns in the east, and they're killing, or they're actually holding it. They're trying, like with an actual trial, no matter how crude. They're trying these corrupt and abusive landlords and officials, and they're killing them, and they're punishing them. Compare this to Bautista. Bautista's men are being ordered to find the Fidelistas and kill them, and they were under orders to interrogate and torture anyone suspected of being a Castro helper. So Bautista's men are getting less and less popular because of these brutal actions. Castro's men are getting more popular because Castro forbade brutality. Even though he took prisoners of war, and he was, staying in the homes of these peasants in the countryside, they were never torturing or killing them unless they had hurt someone else. And that's going to be called this is the rural campaign, this Sierra Maestra area. Castro is going to be stockpiling. He's going to be using a lot of guerrilla warfare, so that means he's going to be ambushing Bautista's men. Anyway, so that's how he's going to be getting supplies, and he's getting the support in the east. But in the city, so in the western areas and just in the more populated parts of Cuba, M26-7 resistance cells are still, doing their thing. They're working with other anti-Bautista groups, such as the Orthodox Party members and some other the students are a very popular group. And they're doing coordinated strikes, they're doing anti-regime graffiti, they're disseminating info on Castro, but it's not as effective as the rural campaign. I hope you remember Frank Pais. He was the one who ran the M26-7 resistance cell in Santiago before Castro's arrival. But Frank Pais, he's murdered by the Bautista police, and that sparks riots everywhere, from Santiago in the east to Camagüey and Las Villas. And Las Villas and Camagüey, if you want a reference, if this is Cuba, they're kind of in the middle, to the left of those mountains. Anyway, so yeah, they're going crazy. Where are we? Oh, and Bautista's already pretty unpopular, but he's going to make himself more unpopular because he suspends constitutional rights in response to all of these riots after Frank Pais's death. That's in 1957. By 1958, Bautista has basically lost all of his support in the East. He is getting constantly attacked by Castro's men, who are, by the way, growing by the day. And Castro's men keep using guerrilla warfare, a lot of ambushes, so it's very difficult for them to maintain ground. So Bautista withdraws his forces from Sierra Maestra. And Castro tries to use this opportunity, Bautista getting out of Sierra Maestra, to attack. He organizes an M26-7 movement strike. It was nationwide, and yes, they did manage to get the strike working, but Bautista just responded with brutality. And so, on the bright side, nothing changed, but on the bad side, nothing changed. People still hated Bautista. Bautista's army was getting pretty demoralized. The public opinion was bad. That's the state. So in 1958, Bautista realizes, hey, this is going nowhere. Castro is a legitimate, kind of issue. He just kicked him out of Sierra Maestra and has taken basically the central and the eastern part. He needs to act fast. So Bautista gets 12,000 soldiers. That's Air Force, sea, land, army. You get it. But Bautista ends up losing this war. This civil war, if you could, I guess it's a war. He loses it because of these 12,000 soldiers, even though Castro only has 3,000 men at his height. Over 6,000 of Bautista's soldiers were untrained, and they were conscripts. They were just being forced to fight. They were being paid, blah, blah, blah. They don't want to fight. Bautista also only has 2 generals, and one of them's a Nepo baby. They have no skills. They're unqualified for the job. Castro also has been doing guerrilla warfare for 2 years at this point. So he's got the home field advantage, and public support is for Castro. So there was actually a brief moment in 1958 called the Battle of Las Mercedes. Castro's army was trapped. It was almost about to die. But Castro managed to negotiate. Okay, so he set up a meeting where they were going to allegedly negotiate a ceasefire, but that was really just Castro stalling for time so the rebels could slip away, and it worked. The rebels slipped away. So when the ceasefire negotiation failed, and Bautista's men went to go and go back to fighting and killing Castro's men were nowhere to be found. And then by December of 1958, because Bautista's army, a lot of them didn't even want to fight, they just defected over to Castro's side. So Castro's army is growing with peasants and army deserters, and he's gonna go past Sierra Maestra. He's gonna defeat the Bautista's army in Yaguajay. This is Yaguajay. Here's a wonderful map. And then there's going to be some fighting in other more western cities like Santa Clara, until finally Bautista on January 2nd of 1959 makes it to Havana. Bautista flees to the Dominican Republic, and Castro takes power. That's Castro's rise. Some interesting things to note is that at some point after the 1954 election that Bautista promised, because of the relaxation of censorship laws, it kind of got out, what Bautista was doing to the outside world. The New York Times was running a lot of pro-Castro articles at this point. They're denouncing Bautista. And so the U.S. government is under a lot of pressure to not support this regime. So they withdraw their support. They ban all weapon sales to Cuba. And while this doesn't, in practice, change anything because they had stockpiled so many U.S. weapons, it does show, it shook the confidence of U.S. investors. And so a lot of U.S. investors are pulling their money from Cuba. And that's really crippling the economy and losing Bautista's support because, the standard of living is decreasing now. So that's part of why Bautista failed. And the rest is just kind of summary of about things that we've talked about already, his corruption, his reliance on gangs and violence, and the fact that he kissed so much U.S. ass, then when the U.S. left, he was left with nothing. And here's just like a quick cheat sheet on the political parties. We've got the PSPs, the Popular Socialist Party, the Communists, and then we've got the Auténticos. Those are the nationalists who later become more conservative. Grau is technically a Auténtico. Bautista was an Auténtico too. And the Orthodox Party that Castro comes from emerged from the PSP and the Auténticos because they were so incensed with the way that they were, with the corruption that was rife within the Auténticos and PSP. And dear fucking Lord, that is everything. Yeah. Good luck on your quiz.